Sony dominated the generation with the PS2, so when they set their sights in the portable market, the expectations were enormous. This, my friends, is the story of every PSP ever made. Sony first ventured into the handheld gaming market long ago, even before the PS2. This foray was more than a little obscure compared to the big-ticket handhelds like the PSP and the Vita, partially because it was a device that was only released in Japan. In 1999, Sony sold the Pocket Station. It was just a little guy that looked like a Tamagotchi that was about the size of a pair of AirPods. It was a combination PlayStation 1 memory card and handheld gaming device. That sounds familiar because it is very, very similar to Sega's VMU for the Dreamcast, which also combined memory and mini-games. The Pocket Station had an LCD screen, flash memory, and even had sound, a true technological marvel. Some PlayStation games, such as Final Fantasy VII, offered mini-games or additional content designed for use with the Pocket Station. Now, while the device was popular in Japan, it never was officially released worldwide, likely due to a strategic decision by Sony to focus on the upcoming PS2, which is of course right on the horizon. That relative success fueled Sony's true portable ambitions. You might see what they thought they could take on the reigning champ Nintendo, whose Game Boy had become synonymous with handheld gaming. But by the 2000s, Nintendo had been making handheld gaming devices for over 20 years and dominated the market for more than half that time. The Game Boy in every iteration was the gold standard for portable gaming. The Game Boy did face some competition from more powerful rivals such as Sega's Game Gear and Atari's Lynx, boasting backlit displays and superior graphics. Although, let's be honest, viewed by today's standards, these all sucked. The Lynx and Game Gear were just a little less terrible. Gaming magazines at the time gave glowing reviews and said that the Lynx throws the Game Boy back into the prehistoric age. So why then did the primitive Game Boy that was left totally powerless without the light from a passing street lamp through the window in the backseat of your dad's Accord, or the Game Boy that didn't, have a backlit display? Like, how could this become the king of the hill? Well, really, the Game Boy's dominance came down to two main factors: batteries and games. Handhelds like the Game Gear and Lynx were more advanced, sure. The Game Gear could display 32 colors at once out of a max palette of 4,096 compared to the Game Boy's measly 4 shades of green. But as we know from modern handhelds, more power takes more battery. In the olden days, that meant more AA batteries. I don't know about you, but my parents weren't happy with needing 2 or 4 AA's a week for my Game Boy Color, let alone, 12 AA's a week for your Game Gear. And while the games for the Game Gear and the Lynx were more sophisticated from a graphics standpoint, the Game Boy, with its iconic titles like Pokemon, Kirby, and Mario, offered a more accessible and family-friendly experience. Now, plenty of other handhelds did come and go throughout the 90s, from the Neo Geo to the WonderSwan, all with their own unique take on the gaming handheld. But Nintendo continued to steamroll the competition, and with each generation they dominated the market. So Sony knew they had to bring something special to the table to dethrone the Game Boy. What about, and I know this is a revolutionary concept, a portable PlayStation? That naming conversation must have been so easy. Sony's strategy was simple: outgun Nintendo on the hardware front. The Game Boy Advance that was on sale at the time was a terrific console for 2D-based Super Nintendo-style sprite graphics. But ultimately, it was just a better version of the 1989 Game Boy. There was plenty of hype for what would eventually be the PlayStation Portable even before its 2004 release. Then CEO of PlayStation, shout out Ken Kutaragi, he teased the device as, quote, the Walkman of the 21st century. Now, while the comparison was vague, the technical specs they announced generated a lot of excitement about the potential of a portable PlayStation handheld. It used a cutting-edge 32-bit MIPS R32 CPU, originally clocked at 222 MHz, but later pushed to 333 MHz with a 3.50 firmware update. Also, just side note, imagine today you get like an update for your Switch and suddenly it's like overclocked by 50%. Like, man, these were the days. Actually, Nintendo should do that actually, because they could technically just set the Switch clocks to like where they're supposed to be, but they just didn't. Sony did though. They didn't just settle for making something equivalent to a portable PS1. Sony aimed higher to create a handheld that could rival the PS2's mighty emotion engine and graphic synthesizer. This is unlike what Nintendo ended up doing with the DS that was also in development at the same time, which had much less ambitious performance targets, closer to something like the last generation N64. Let's just pause for a second to truly grasp the significance of this ambition. Nowadays, almost 2 decades later, we're used to devices like the Steam Deck, which are able to run modern AAA games, but at significantly lower settings. The PSP was aiming to come close to the cutting edge of consoles at the time. Sony's ambition didn't just stop at raw power. They also took another lesson from a big feature of the PS2, multimedia. While the DVD drive was off the table, probably more so because it wasn't proprietary enough for Sony, they instead outfitted the PSP with a tiny optical drive dubbed the UMD. Now these are little discs to play not only games, but also movies and music videos. With each weighing in at either 900 megabytes or 1.8 gigabytes, they were impressively dense for something so small, comfortably more so than a CD, and enough space to hold a full-length movie. Now, if you didn't want to carry dozens of UMD discs around, users could also load it up with their own video files and MP3s. It also supported downloading games with the proprietary memory stick Duo, which was a feature that came a couple years after launch, and that certainly improved things even further. With 4 to 5 hours of video playback and 8 to 11 hours of audio playback, the PSP was a true multimedia powerhouse. Keep in mind that this was 3 whole years before the first iPhone was even a thing. All those features meant that it was not going to be a cheap handheld. In the US, the PSP cost $250 at launch, which was quite expensive for the time. For context, Nintendo rolled out the DS with a $150 price tag, a much more reasonable amount, especially considering that the Game Boy had been around that $100 mark for years at that point. Despite the high price, the launch of the PSP was a success. In Japan, Sony sold more than 200,000 units on launch day. When it was eventually released in the US in early 2005, they sold about 500,000 units for the launch weekend. In fact, they sold so well that it was difficult to keep up with demand, and it pushed the entire global launch back just because they couldn't make enough of the damn things. Now, the UK launch at the end of 2005 sold through their entire stock of 185,000 units in 3 hours. Almost 1 million units were sold across Europe in the first week of sales. But Nintendo's DS was looming in the background, and it was clear that Nintendo weren't going to give up the golden goose without a fight. In November of 2004, a few months before the PSP went on sale in North America, the DS sold about 500,000 units in the US alone. Sales quickly ramped up to 1 million units by the end of 2004, largely thanks to people trampling each other during Black Friday. At this point, the stage was set for a fierce battle. The PSP's launch was a resounding success, but Sony wasn't just going to sit back and chill. Over the years, Sony iterated and made some really iconic PSPs. The original PSP 1000, known as the Fat PSP, was the heaviest PSP, but for good reason. It had the biggest battery at 1800 mAh, compared to a much smaller 1200 mAh cell on later models. The LCD panels were considered some of the worst in the PSP lineup. Although it wasn't too bad compared to the DS, it was prone to ghosting and high response times. Now, I'm certainly biased here, since I did have a 1000, but it still feels the most solid in my opinion, and it was one of many Sony consoles where the first version was best in a lot of ways before later models cut costs to bring the price tag down. Learning from the original PSP shortcomings, Sony released the PSP 2000, also known as the Slim. The 2000 addressed some of the screen quality issues of its predecessor, as well as the general bulkiness, although this slimmer design did come at the cost of that smaller 1200 mAh battery. Although users did find workarounds, as you could technically fit the older, bigger batteries from the 1000 into the 2000, just as long as you don't mind not being able to put a back cover on. Now, importantly, they also doubled the RAM from 32 to 64 megabytes, which was a legitimate upgrade and led to noticeably faster load times. Significantly, this model also marked the first major price drop in the PSP lifecycle, going from $250 to $169 for the core pack system, basically the PSP without all the extra accessories. Building on the Slim success, the PSP 3000 further refined the handheld's design and is generally known as the best PSP from an overall perspective. It kept all the upgrades from the 2000 and also featured an upgraded screen, which was brighter and offered better contrast, pixel response, and less glare. It was unofficially known as the Bright model, especially in marketing, and it did make for a noticeably better gaming experience. Unless you're really sensitive to scan lines, or slightly inaccurate colors. Now, the software was a lot more locked down at this point, a response to something we'll talk about in a little bit later, but here's the thing. Sony wasn't satisfied with just improving the PSP. They clearly wanted to push the boundaries of handheld design. Remember, this is the old Sony, who made the bizarre Vio systems all through the 2000s. It's almost like they looked at one of those old, remember the LG sliding phones? They're like, hey, let's do that, except for the PSP. Well, they did, and it was the PSP Go. It was a bold experiment that perhaps pushed the tech of the day just a little too far. Despite the PSP's already compact size, Sony aimed to make it even smaller with the Go. They started by eliminating the UMD drive in favor of digital downloads. They added 16 gigabytes of expandable flash storage, and they got rid of about a quarter of the weight. That means that they went all digital, which I probably don't need to tell you was controversial to say the least all the way back in 2009. 15 years later, we're only just starting to properly phase out physical media, so I'm sure that didn't hurt sales at all for the Go. Oh wait, no, actually it did. It hurt, like, significantly, like, a lot. There aren't any official numbers, but the PSP Go most likely sold less than 1 million units total, a drop in the bucket compared to the 80+ million PSPs sold overall. The quirky sliding form factor with the tiny button layout, the lack of a physical drive, and the more expensive retail price of $250 was just a recipe for disaster, even though I've always irrationally loved it. Recognizing the need for a more affordable option, Sony introduced the PSP Street in 2011. Even at $170 for the regular 3000 model, it was still consistently a bit more expensive than the Nintendo DS line, specifically the massive selling DS Lite. As the last PSP to be released, the 2011 Street was a budget-focused version similar to the 3000, except it got rid of some very important features like Wi-Fi and stereo speakers, not to mention it cheapened the build quality quite a bit. For all the cost cutting, you could at least get it for a very affordable €99. I say Euro because they mostly sold it in Europe as well as in some parts of Asia as well as Australia. Now, despite its budget-oriented design, the PSP Street actually wasn't as bad as it might have seemed. The screen was improved, and performance-wise, it was actually a little better than the standard 3000, with loading times that were either on par or improved from every other PSP edition. So surely, all those improvements, coupled with a strong launch, meant the PSP won the handheld console war, right? Right? Now, in our quest to get our hands on every bit of PSP paraphernalia that has ever existed, I have this, a PSP dev kit. Now, we actually did a video on this. We did a mystery tech a little while ago, in fact, probably a couple years ago at this point. And what's cool about this is that this has a lot of special features, including the ability to play not only UMDs, but also DVDs, and it has a bunch of debug stuff. It's a neat little Easter egg into the past. Also, I'm not giving it back. Sony, not supposed to have dev kits. They get kind of grumpy about it. Probably the biggest issue with the PSP was the fact that it only had a single analog stick. Now, it was fine, it was doable, but this actually really held you back for certain types of games because without the ability to use dual analog sticks, your control method was oftentimes going back and forth on the same hand between the analog stick and the D-pad, back and forth. And that was not great, especially for some games where you wanted to, look and aim at the same time. Even though this technically was really quite powerful, it always felt like it never fully lived up to its potential in a way that today you don't really see a mobile version of like a Switch game. Like you just get the game. Maybe it doesn't look as good, but you get that full experience. But with the PSP, this was still back in an era where a mobile version of a game was almost always a more watered down experience. So it just kind of goes to show that if a developer had the time and money to fully commit to the PSP, you could get great results. But so many titles felt like they were like 80% the sort of full potential that they had. While the PSP racked up a respectable 81 million units sold worldwide, the Nintendo DS sold a staggering 154 million units. That's almost twice as many sales. So what went wrong? Well, let's cut to the chase. The PSP was not a failure. I asked what went wrong, but honestly, nothing really did go horribly wrong. On the contrary, the PSP is still the best-selling non-Nintendo gaming handheld of all time. For some context, the PSP sold almost 4 times as many consoles as the GameCube, about as many units as the Game Boy Advance, and almost as many sales as the original PlayStation, all of which are viewed as successful and beloved game consoles. Well, maybe the GameCube was a little bit more beloved than successful, but look, this handheld generation was just a unique one. The Nintendo DS was dominant, but Sony did sell a lot of PSPs, just not quite as many. There are a few key reasons for this. Partially, the smartphone revolution began during this generation, but a big one was that the DS was just simply cheaper. The DS also had a much bigger game library that appealed to a broader audience. The DS's most popular games included titles such as Nintendogs, which, fun fact, is actually the second best-selling DS game as long as you bundle all of the individual versions together, and it had an overwhelmingly female player base. Compare that to the PSP, which had a decidedly more grown-up, cool demo, with some of the most popular games being Grand Theft Auto and Monster Hunter and God of War. You can kind of guess what kind of demo those games were targeted toward. There's no Nintendogs on PSP. They had Invisimals, which was far inferior. The PSP's unintentionally open platform for customization and homebrew was thanks to the easy hacks that were absolutely everywhere, but it was a double-edged sword. While it fostered a passionate community of modders and tinkerers, it also made the PSP a haven for piracy, and Sony were not happy. I remember you could load up movies, games, and some other more adult things. Believe me when I say, the PSP was a real eye-opener for me.
PlayStation Portable.
That opens up Pandora's box.
As the first device I owned with Wi-Fi and a portable browser, it was a very seminal moment in young Austin's life. I mean, some real great features. The PSP was just a special device. Now, some parents maybe expressed concerns about the PSP's very open nature, and this, paired with piracy, did almost certainly dent some of the PSP's momentum. Sony also played whack-a-mole with updates meant to shut down custom firmwares, which are mildly successful for a bit, but largely just served to annoy the modding community. Sony's marketing efforts for the PSP were also often, shall we say, misguided, failing to highlight its cool features and generating plenty of controversy. Just like with the PS2, I don't know what Sony were thinking with the marketing on the PSP. I mean, from an ad that, quote, "take a running jump here" on a train platform, to a racially charged warning that PlayStation Portable White is coming. Holy shit. I know that was a long time ago, but no. Now, I'm not gonna say that Nintendo's touching is good marketing campaign was much better. Good lord. But at least that one was a little more cringe and not controversial, just sort of stupid. The PSP, though, really did push the limits on how powerful a gaming handheld can be. It aimed to replicate the full console experience on the go, and it came really close. Meanwhile, the DS just took a different approach. In that regard, Sony was ahead of its time. I mean, it's only recently, with the Steam Deck and ROG Allies of the world, that we've had console-level handhelds again. I think it's safe to say that people are really appreciating the PSP-ness of handhelds these days. You wrote the line! You can't laugh at me, but you wrote the line! There's no way around it, though. The DS, with its innovative dual screen and touchscreen interface, it really revolutionized handheld gaming. And a lot of games like WarioWare or Zelda Phantom Hourglass were much more creative and took advantage of the dual screens, the touch input, and even the microphone, like giving your Nintendogs commands. Sit. Go to the hotel forever, because Joanna doesn't want you anymore.
Not the hotel.
I really want to be clear here. The PSP was not a bad handheld, and it certainly was not a failure. There's still a thriving community of people who use their PSPs even to this day. In fact, Ken just made a custom PSP a little while ago that looks dope. It just so happened to be against the absolute juggernaut that was the Nintendo DS. But trust me when I say that the PSP put up a valiant effort. And for that, I salute the PSP. You know, I think this is what it feels like for everyone who's trying to compete with the PS2. You ever like seen like the video where like, the guy who's a lot taller and has longer reach puts his hand on the guy's face. You're like this, you're like, I'm trying. And the DS is like, stop. Except it probably didn't sound that cool because the DS was not as cool as the PSP. Well, if it's any consolation, I'm sure that Sony will definitely take the handheld gaming crown next time around, right? right? I hear the Vita's gonna be great. Wait, they stopped making PlayStation Portables, didn't they? I wonder how that happened. Huh. Oh, right, I forgot. The PlayStation Portal really no, that's a different video. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel and ring-a-ling, the ding-a-ling if you enjoyed this. Because stay tuned. Next time around, we're taking a trip all the way to 2006 to take a look at the most ambitious game console of all time, the PlayStation 3.